They planted their crops. They prayed for rain. But when harvest season came, there were no buyers, no contracts, no payments, just silence. In just 6 weeks, U.S. farm exports to China dropped by 28%. At the port of Oakland, almond and dairy shipments plummeted by 40%. And in Washington state, hay exporters are laying off 25% of their workforce because their customers are gone, and no one is stepping in to replace them. This isn't just a troubling headline. It's the quiet, rapid, and government-approved collapse of the American farm economy. So, ask yourself, how does the world's most productive agricultural economy end up desperate for buyers while its leaders boast about a trade war? U.S. sorghum exports to China didn't just decline, they were wiped out. In just 2 months, shipments fell from 1.44 million metric tons in early 2023 to just 78,000 during the same period this year. That's a 94.4% collapse, according to USDA trade data. The reason? China's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agricultural imports now exceed 125%, making American grain not just expensive, but irrelevant in its biggest market. Meanwhile, grain silos are overflowing, prices are crashing, and there are no new buyers on the horizon. Yet the federal response has been largely symbolic, not structural. The White House once promised farmers would be winning. Now, that promise feels more like satire, especially as China shifts to long-term deals with Brazil and Argentina. And the unsettling question remains: if this wasn't the plan, why isn't anyone stopping it? The data shows a clear pattern. Tariffs rise, demand disappears, and supply chains reroute permanently. Before the trade war, China bought over 90% of all U.S. sorghum exports. That trade pipeline is now cut off, and the impact goes far beyond one crop. As China shifts its agricultural contracts toward Latin America, the foundation of U.S. export dominance is rapidly unraveling. According to Bloomberg, China's soybean imports from Brazil jumped 25% year over year, while U.S. soybean futures dropped over 14% in the first quarter of 2025. These aren't short-term adjustments, they're long-term shifts in global trade infrastructure. And if U.S. policymakers think these tariffs can simply be reversed, they may be misjudging how global commodity logistics actually work. At the port of Oakland, America's leading hub for refrigerated agricultural exports, slowdowns are turning into layoffs, storage costs, and rising economic pressure. Port Executive Director Christy McKenna warned that retaliatory delays are not just hurting exports of almonds, dairy, and beef, they're also threatening the jobs of dock workers, truck drivers, and warehouse staff. Oakland's balanced 50-50 import-export flow makes it especially exposed to trade retaliation. China accounts for nearly 30% of the port's total trade volume, and the tariffs are hitting nearly every U.S. agricultural product that moves through it. This isn't some distant theoretical concern. It's real. Containers are sitting idle. Contracts are getting canceled. Exporters are stuck paying fees for shipments abandoned at sea. Forage exporters reported 68 blank sailings since the most recent tariff hike was announced in April. One hay exporter in Washington laid off 25% of its staff in just 2 weeks, citing canceled orders and sky-high freight costs. Another exporter of wood pulp reported 6,400 metric tons of goods trapped in warehouses and 15 rail cars, incurring storage fees while waiting for instructions. One shipment of 9,000 metric tons en route to China may be abandoned altogether. "We can't afford to ship without taking a loss," the exporter said. "The economics just don't work." Bulk commodities like hay, grain, and dairy operate on razor-thin margins. They can't survive in a pricing system designed for high-end luxury goods. And yet, under the new U.S. Shipping Reform Act, port fees now exceed $1.5 million per Chinese vessel, but bulk agriculture is exempted only partially. Containerized goods, which make up 55% of the value of all U.S. agricultural exports, including meat, dairy, almonds, frozen vegetables, and processed foods, are still exposed. Peter Friedman of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition warned CNBC that failing to carve out exemptions for containerized farm products risks punishing the most valuable part of American agriculture, just as international buyers are walking away. Despite industry appeals, U.S. regulators declined to comment on whether those exemptions are even being considered. That leaves exporters doing the math. How many more shipments can they afford to send at a loss before they stop exporting altogether? And here's the hard truth. These aren't changes you can fix in a weekend. Global supply chains are long-term systems built on contracts, infrastructure, and financing. Brazil's soybean dominance wasn't built overnight. It took 3 years of investment, government support, and port upgrades. Now that China has committed to those alternatives, re-entering the market, if possible at all, would require the U.S. to negotiate from a weakened position. Global agriculture doesn't respond to short-term policies. It responds to long-term signals. And right now, traders interviewed by Reuters say the message coming from Washington is one of instability. That's why buyers are locking in alternatives elsewhere. The real risk isn't just losing this year's business. It's disappearing from the spreadsheets for the next decade. The White House is considering another bailout to prevent mass bankruptcies. But farmer associations like the National Farmers Union and the American Soybean Association are skeptical. A government check can't reopen a closed port. It can't rebuild a lost contract. And it can't restore trust with international buyers. In Iowa, corn farmers are planting this season knowing they'll probably lose money, because not planting at all means going bankrupt even faster. In Kentucky, some farmers are debating whether to harvest their crops at all. It's no longer about making a profit. It's about minimizing the damage. And yet, while farmers are triaging losses, Washington continues to focus on stimulus packages. But the industry is asking for just one thing: access to markets. For the first time in years, major farm groups are supporting legislation to rein in the White House's tariff authority. The National Farmers Union now backs a bill that would require congressional approval for broad trade actions, arguing that unchecked power has done disproportionate damage to agriculture. Peter Friedman echoed what many in the industry are now saying. This isn't a crisis in the making. It is a full-blown crisis. Speaking to CNBC, he pointed out how rare it is to see so many agricultural groups united on an issue, which highlights just how serious things have become. Even the American Farm Bureau Federation, a traditionally conservative voice in agricultural policy, has joined the call for trade restraint. That alone signals a major shift. The economic damage from this trade war is no longer something even its former supporters can justify. Tariffs are typically intended to protect domestic producers from being undercut by cheaper imports. But what's actually happening on the ground tells a different story. Data from the Agriculture Transportation Coalition and USDA shows that retaliatory tariffs from China, Canada, and the EU have slashed US farm exports, leaving domestic markets flooded with unsold inventory. A glaring example: China recently canceled a 12,000-ton US pork order, its largest since 2020, leaving producers with perishable goods and no backup buyers. To make matters worse, new port fee regulations from the U.S. Shipping Reform Act now charge $1.5 million per Chinese vessel. While meant to target shipping issues, the fees hit containerized agriculture hardest, a segment that accounts for 55% of the value of all U.S. agricultural exports. These aren't minor hiccups. They're structural penalties that are hurting the very farmers tariffs were meant to support. While food prices continue to rise, farmers aren't seeing the benefit. Take the 2024 egg shortage. Callan Foods made over $1 billion in profit, while smaller producers struggled with a 20% jump in feed costs due to tariffs on Canadian imports. According to Reuters, Trump's latest tariff regime, one of the most aggressive in nearly a century, has pushed consumer food prices up almost 18% year over year. Yet farm incomes, especially for small and mid-sized operations, are falling. This contradiction points to a deeper issue. The pricing power in our food system has shifted away from the people who grow the food and toward the corporations that process and distribute it. Instead of protecting U.S. agriculture, these tariffs are helping large agribusinesses widen their margins while forcing independent farmers closer to insolvency. American food production is no longer linked directly to farmer profitability. It's now tied to global trade networks and corporate supply chains. Decades of policy, from NAFTA to recent farm bills, have encouraged overproduction while relying on foreign buyers to maintain price stability. That system is now unraveling. Bloomberg reports that over 40% of US soy, corn, and wheat growers say they can't break even without dependable export contracts. With rising input costs and shrinking markets, the cracks are starting to show, not just in trade, but in the entire economic structure that was built on assumptions of cheap land, infinite demand, and uninterrupted growth. When 68 cargo sailings are canceled in a single month, followed by layoffs, it's not just a red flag, it's system failure. During Trump's first term, the farm bailout from tariff damage cost over $32 billion, yet it failed to fix the deeper trade imbalances. Now, with tariffs ramping up again, China has pivoted to Brazil, Canada has hit back with a 25% duty on US agricultural products, and the momentum US farmers once had in global markets is being dismantled. The Wall Street Journal reports that rural banks are already seeing signs of stress. Loan defaults are rising, particularly in heavily agricultural counties. Instead of building resilience, the ongoing cycle of trade wars and bailouts is creating dependency without a real solution. Trump promised farmers leverage. What many got instead was instability, canceled contracts, and a shrinking customer base. There was a time when US farm policy was built around supply management. Tools like price floors, conservation incentives, and strategic reserves kept food systems and farmer income stable. Research from the University of Missouri suggests that maintaining those policies through 2020 would have cost 37% less than the bailouts, all while preserving market share abroad. Tariffs can be part of a broader industrial strategy, especially when paired with investments like the CHIPS Act or climate-smart subsidies. But on their own, they don't work unless they're part of a cohesive plan, one that addresses monopolies, invests in infrastructure, and restores autonomy to farmers. Right now, that kind of plan doesn't exist. We're relying on outdated economic tools with no modern roadmap, and farmers are the ones paying the price for each wrong turn. So, what happens when a trade war turns into something bigger? A complete collapse of trust between farmers and markets, between government policy and real-life consequences, between Washington and the people who feed the country? That's no longer a hypothetical. It's happening right now. Tariffs make headlines, but the real question is what comes after the headlines fade? What happens when every shipping route gets rerouted, every contract canceled, and every bailout fund dries up? Who's still standing in the American Farm Belt? Because the next battle won't be about tariffs. It'll be about survival. And the clock is still ticking.